Good morning from Berlin, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christian Redl, and together with my colleague Matthias, whom some of you have met already in our first webinar, we are delighted to welcome you to this webinar on the topic of a pragmatic power market design for Europe's energy transition. We have over 100 registered participants from all over Europe, even some guests from Asia joining us, so very warm welcome to all of you. As you know, the topic of power market design is intensely debated throughout Europe because decarbonization of the European power sector rests on continuous investments in both renewables and flexibility options. And usually it is expected that a reformed energy market together with a reformed emissions trading scheme will deliver these investments. But is this enough to actually get the required scale of investments based on or also under real-world constraints? So it's these questions which are the point of departure for our webinar. Before we dive into the details though, allow me some organizational remarks. You can find all information related to the webinar on our homepage, so that concerns first of all, of course, the paper. This webinar is based on the Power Market Pentagon, also the presentation of the webinar, and finally, in some days, I guess, also recording of the webinar, which you can also then watch on our YouTube channel. In fact, you can already now download the webinar presentation. A little pointer should appear on the screen now, indicating the position where you can download it. Also now, a little window should appear in the upper right corner of your screen, where you can pose any content-wise questions you might have regarding the webinar content. We will deal with these questions to the extent possible after the presentation, the Q&A session. It's only us who will see these questions. The other webinar participants will not see them, but still we encourage you to mention your name so we can introduce you accordingly when taking up or picking your question. In case we will not manage all questions, we will try to follow up individually by email afterwards. Also, you can use this chat window to not only submit content-wise questions. In case you should or would experience some issues or problems with the webinar software, please also submit your technical questions, and my colleague Nicola Bock, who is sitting next to me, will deal with these questions individually. So thanks for that, Nicola. So much for my introduction, and I will now hand over to my colleague Matthias, who will present the first part of the presentation. Matthias, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Christian, and welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to present this study. As Christian was mentioning, we agreed to share the role of presenting. I will lead you through the introductory part, and then Christian will do some more of the nuts and bolts, and then in replying to questions we probably do wherever we see fit. We've been working on this study, the two of us together with two other colleagues from Agora, and so it's a bit of a shared effort that we replicate in this webinar. Now to the slides. How do I advance them? Okay, thank you. So, now the question is, not Europe, but EU heads of state have set new climate and energy targets for the EU for 2030. This was decided in October 2014 by an European Council. And of course, these decisions by European leaders still await to be translated into refined, revised, new EU legislation that will enter into force after 2020. Most of the current legislative measures at EU level run until 2020. Some are running longer, but most run until 2020. In particular, no, I'm distracted. Okay, but I continue. Okay, so we will have the 2030 climate targets, in particular for renewables. The target set by EU heads of state determines that we will have at least 27% of renewable energy in gross domestic consumption in the EU by 2030. If you are looking into a cost-effective translation of this target into to the different sectors of the energy system, you will find that a cost-effective target achievement in the renewables side will result in an approximate share of 50% renewable electricity in the European power mix by 2030. In some regions, for instance in the Penta region, the expectation is even higher. Now, overall, the climate and energy targets put the power sector at the center of decarbonization of the European energy system. Again, according to cost-effective projections, the contribution of the power sector to emission reductions is larger than of the other sectors, and the emissions from the power sector are to be reduced by about 65% by 2030 to achieve the target, the greenhouse gas reduction target of at least 40%. I was already mentioning the renewables share of this, which is at least 27%. Particularly in the power sector, we are expecting 50%. And now what is important for us is that there are some limitations both on the scaling up for biomass as well as for hydro. And so in the power system, we are expecting that the majority of newly deployed capacity will actually be wind and solar PV, simply because they are the most economic choices, and in addition there are less economic or geographic or limitations to scaling them up. Now this is posing, as we call, a flexibility challenge to the power system, because an increasing share of the renewables part in the mix will be from volatile sources. A second important finding, if you're looking at the 2030 climate and energy targets, relates to the use of coal in power generation. According to projections by the Commission, their diversified supply technology scenario, there is a projection of a 68% of coal use in power generation. To recall, in 2015, 3/4 of CO2 emissions in Europe stemmed from coal and lignite-fired power plants, although these make up only 1/4 of total EU power generation. Now, minus 68% of coal use in power generation means that about half of the current fleet would need to be decommissioned. And one question, of course, is how do we get there in the next 15 years? A further important consideration looking at the 2030 climate and energy targets is that we must transition, for this to be a cost-effective transition, we must transition to a more flexible mix of capacity. The IEA in 2014 published an important study called Power of Transformation, and this is very clearly documenting that if you are simply building new renewable capacity into the existing mix, but not changing the existing mix, that the overall costs of the transition will be significantly higher than if you were to increase the share of flexible resources while also decreasing at the same time the share of inflexible resources. Now, the important point here really is that when we are discussing the power system transformation, we are not only discussing the quantity of installed capacity, but really the quality of the mix as we see it. Now, the question, how do we get cost effectively to 2030, to the 2030 power system, is at the center of our study. And the question is, which market design will get us cost effectively to 2030? Where we're expecting 50% RES-E, a significant decline in coal, and a much more flexible mix. Now, if you are following the discussion that is currently taking place in Brussels, you will observe that there is a predominant discourse on further developing the energy-only market on the one hand side, and further developing the EU emissions trading system. And there is a broad expectation that by doing this, particularly focusing on these two building blocks, this would at the end deliver what we need for a cost-effective transition to 2030. Now, the starting point really for our analysis and contribution to this debate is that we don't believe it is as simple. Why is this not the case in our view? Now, there is a challenge to the market design debate simply because we are in a system transformation. Nobody's doubting that. There is a system transformation, and so there is increasing calls to policymakers to put in place safeguards against blackouts, put it very simply. Now, it's difficult for policymakers to fully resist such calls by pointing to a more effective functioning of the energy-only market. And so what we're seeing in Europe is that an increasing number of member states is putting in place interventions to safeguard system adequacy. And this you see here on the right-hand side. This is not based on our own analysis, but drawing on figures developed by ASA and reflecting the state of play in 2015. And you will see that some of the big member states in terms of generation and consumption, and this is France, UK, Germany, Italy, also Poland, they have already put in place some kind of intervention to safeguard system adequacy, and we will go to more detail during the presentation. The second point that we are highlighting at the outset of our study relates to the emissions trading system. If you are looking at what has been successfully adopted last year, the Market Stability Reserve, and what is now on the table, the increase in the reduction factor in the ETS, and put this together, in our analysis, this is not going to change the situation that we have today, where you have very low emission allowances prices. The important reason for this being, first, that surplus allowances in the system will continue to be in the system for quite some time. That we have such a large amount of surplus allowances in the system is reflecting a politically set amount of emissions that probably was much too generous when the system was started. Secondly, that we had a much higher than expected influx of emission allowances from JI and CDM projects. And thirdly, that Europe was going through a financial and economic crisis in the years 2007 and after. And all of this has added up to a huge amount of unused emission allowances, and because the allowances are bankable, this means that they just remain in the system until they are being used. Now, the important introduction of the Market Stability Reserve last year, in our analysis, does not mean, and I think this is important for the debate on the ETS, that the allowances are really outside of the system. They are just sitting next to the allowances that are actively being traded. And if you're looking to the right-hand side graph here, this means that we will have surplus allowances sitting next to the market in the stability reserve. And to recall, they will be let back into the market if there are certain scarcity thresholds reached in the system, but we will have surplus allowances in the system sitting in the reserve until well beyond the 2020-2030 decade. Which means that in the discussion on the 2020 to 2030 EU level framework, we need to start from a situation where we cannot expect emission allowance prices to be much higher than we currently see, unless, of course, something else is happening. Now, these basic observations are really our starting point into the Power Market Pentagon study, and we are making the case that a market design that fits for a cost-effective power system transformation really needs to take a broader perspective. We cannot only discuss a reformed energy-only market or a reformed ETS, but we need to broaden our perspective and also take into consideration further challenges that do have a significant impact on investment choices in the power system. So we are proposing to discuss not only 2, but really 5 elements and look at them holistically. And this is what we're trying to do in our study. Now, elements that have not been, that are not really as much discussed at the moment as part of the power market design debate are, in addition to emissions trading and the energy-only market, are the need for what we call smart and managed retirement of high carbon assets. Secondly, the need for continued revenue stabilization for renewable energy investments. And thirdly, the question how interventions to safeguarding system adequacy are relating to investment choices in the power system. Now, in the study, we are highlighting that there are interactions between all those elements. Of course, there is, I think, a broad understanding that refining the energy-only market is as such a no regret. But importantly, and this I think is where we are contributing to the debate, is that the effectiveness of market design reforms is limited unless the issue of smart retirement of old high carbon and inflexible capacity is tackled. Now, this needs to be tackled primarily at national level, but there need to be some enabling EU level conditions for this. The same goes for reformed ETS. Currently, the ETS is not supporting smart retirement actively through the CO2 price. It is also not helping it through the way the system is operating. Furthermore, looking at the expected evolution of ETS allowance prices, we believe that there will need to be a continued revenue, not need to be, that there will be a continued revenue gap for renewables investments into the system, and this will need to be closed. And of course, there's a discussion on how best to close this gap and to reduce it as much as possible. At last, I think it is important that when considering system adequacy safeguards, that these need to be consistent with the challenge of RES-E integration and the retirement of high carbon assets that, as I was pointing out, are a precondition for a more effective functioning of the energy-only market. Now, these are some of the more high-level messages that emerge when looking more holistically at the power market debate through a Pentagon focus, and my colleague Christian will now lead you through some of the more detailed considerations under the individual elements. Christian, over to you.
Thanks very much, Matthias. I will now guide you through these 5 elements, specifically with respect to issues which should be taken on a European level. So what should European provisions be to in some end up with a meaningful picture of the new power market design. The first element, as Matthias already mentioned, is certainly a no-regret option, enhancing energy-only and balancing markets. Why? Because the power market has to become more flexible to ensure a continuous interplay between all market actors, be it on the supply side and on the demand side. Now, we are moving into this world where wind and PV will contribute increasing shares to meeting European power demand, and with that comes the so-called flexibility challenge, which you can see in this graph on the left. It basically exemplifies this by looking into a week in 2030 in the Central Western European power market, and you can see that in that week, which is a week in late summer, at certain hours, the pink line, which is the power demand in that region, is already fully met by renewables, mainly wind and solar PV. In some other hours, it's mainly then conventional power plants or storage which have to meet the load. This means that this new system will be characterized by increased system ramps induced by the fluctuating renewables. And to ensure this interplay between different generation options, renewables, conventional storage, demand, we need these strong price signals emerging from an energy-only market, which can then steer supply and demand. And to get to this, basically key features of this refined market design would be, first of all, to increasingly couple the energy markets across price zones, also making them faster, which means that we have shorter product lengths. Currently, there is some momentum going towards 15-minute products with 30-minute gate closure times. Some of the countries in Europe have this implemented already. Others are moving in that direction. But of course, in the medium term, we will also need to see progressive improvements at both angles and dimensions. It's also important to improve the predictability of scarcity prices. This is especially important to get power prices better reflecting the real-time value of power, and it's also important to support efficient investments in, say, flexibility options. Key, of course, when it comes to flexibility provision is to get a level playing field for all the market actors. Currently, the market design, especially in the balancing markets, is not providing for this level playing field yet. So typically, demand side response or renewables are not fully allowed to enter these markets, and of course, you can expect that they will indeed have to become important flexibility options. So balancing markets are important, but of course also with shortening product lengths, intraday markets get increased importance because most of the flexibility is still traded and will also be traded in the future in the energy markets and not in the balancing markets. It's important that all these design provisions do not distort the price formation, and then in the end, the main aim should be to better link prices from the day ahead down to the intraday and balancing markets to in the end up with these prices reflecting the real-time value of power. As I've mentioned, that's really key to manage the flexibility challenge. The second element, a reformed emissions trading scheme. We consider the main role of the ETS in the power sector that it should facilitate a fuel shift from high carbon to low carbon fossil fuel power. It's not the right instrument in our field to drive investments into renewables, because then specifically for wind and PV, and I will come back to that later, you would need very high CO2 prices. Matthias mentioned already in the range of 60 euros to get these investments solely market-based, which would be inefficient and also critical for, let's say, energy industrial companies in Europe. So the main role, as said, providing this fuel shift from high carbon to low carbon power, which means we would need a carbon price of about 30 euros per ton CO2 to get this fuel switch on the one hand from old lignite power to new hard coal power plants, and from old hard coal power plants to new gas-fired power plants. As we've seen in the past, and this is also observable in this graph, the CO2 prices so far as observed in the ETS, that's the blue line, basically too low to facilitate the switch. Only in 2008 and 2010 the CO2 prices were higher than the switch price to get this switch from coal, here exemplified, to gas-fired generation. So under current market conditions, and also given the outlook over the next years, a price of some 30 euros per ton would be sufficient to get this. So one recommendation or one key measure for, let's say, a revision of European policies regarding the ETS is to stabilize the price through implementing a carbon floor price of exactly this 30 euros per ton. But since this will also not be enough to tackle the issue of old and inflexible and depreciated capacities, we will need the smart retirement policies, which I discuss in a minute. So it's important to facilitate a smooth interplay between these elements. So that means in case countries move ahead in Europe with a domestic coal phase out, for example, in the power sector, that it's important that also in the ETS provisions this is accounted for, and specifically such additional allowances which emerge from domestic coal phase-out policies would need to be cancelled in the ETS to facilitate this smooth interplay. And finally, of course, and it's also a link to the market stability reserve, Matthias mentioned it already, it's important also in the longer run to cancel the overall surplus in the EU ETS, not only to make the MSR fully functioning, but also to consider this as a contribution of the European Union to the post-Paris Agreement ratcheting up mechanism. The third element, indeed, is the so-called smart and managed retirement. This is an idea which was first developed in the joint paper by the Regulatory Assistance Project and Agora Energiewende, and was published last autumn. The motivation for this is that the most urgent challenge of the European power markets are the implications of legacy investments, and specifically legacy investments in high carbon and flexible generation. And to illustrate this, on the left-hand side, you see this graph, which is courtesy of Michael Hogan from the Regulatory Assistance Project. You can see the evolution of peak demand in the European power system and the evolution of installed capacities. And specifically, of course, with the European energy and climate targets, you see this increasing share of installed capacities on the renewable side. And at the same time, we still observe a growing amount of conventional fossil-fueled capacities. Now, of course, you cannot fully replace on a megawatt to megawatt basis the capacity addition specifically for the fluctuating or must-run renewables like hydro, wind, or solar PV with conventional ones, but it just gives you, I think, an indication that on aggregate the European power systems is actually very well supplied and even oversupplied. So this means that reforming the market design alone will not be enough to get these previously mentioned investments into both renewables and flexibility options. To get this, you first need to start retiring old and high carbon inflexible capacities. Basically, this is an important prerequisite for successful design reforms with respect to the energy and balancing markets. This, of course, is mainly then a domestic issue, and we indeed see that countries in Europe are moving ahead. The UK has implemented a carbon price floor and also decided to phase out coal. Similar developments with respect to a coal phase out are occurring in Denmark. The Netherlands, this is discussed intensively. Austria is leaving coal, and also in Germany the discussions are gaining momentum. So increasingly domestic action, which has of course to be increased in the future as well. But this also requires European action to again facilitate the smooth interplay between European policies and domestic policies. And one option could be to close gaps in the Industrial Emissions Directive. There are some derogations for older power plants which could, for example, be easily closed. Also, you could think of an appropriate emission performance standard in the European environmental stated guidelines, or example in funding provisions of the European Investment Bank. Also in the context of the the Energy Union, member states are required to develop so-called national energy and climate plans, and also the provisions regarding forming and framing these plans could be that member states should be asked to put a spotlight on system adequacy, the flexibility challenge, and also the required reduction of carbon intensity to meet the longer-term climate targets. Of course, also within secondary law on the European level, there are some options to include that. For example, the ongoing revisions of the Internal Market Directive and the Renewables Directive would provide the room to include the requirements for a transparent flexibility check of national power systems. And finally, as mentioned, the smart retirement initiatives will mainly be national ones. And then, of course, it's important to also give the economic room from the European Union side for moving ahead, specifically in member states with below average GDP ratios. There are, of course, regions which so far depend a lot economically on coal mining, and here help from the EU budget would be required. Moving to the fourth element, revenue mechanisms for new renewables. This is essentially important, and Matthias mentioned it as well, that also for the 2020 to 2030 period, wind and PV require this revenue stabilization. This is essentially due to the economic characteristics of wind and PV. They are characterized by very high capital costs, hardly any variable costs, and they are, so to speak, must-run technologies. So when the resource is available, these technologies produce, and then since they have virtually zero operating costs, they tend to depress market prices. So in hours, when there's lots of wind and PV in the system, the electricity wholesale price will be low, and this means that on average, the market revenue, so the market value of wind and PV, will be lower than the average wholesale price. You see this here on this graph for two scenarios, one with a higher CO2 price of some 45 euros per ton. The power price is here indicated in pink, increasing over time, whereas the market revenues for wind and PV are of course also increasing because overall price levels on the market are increasing, but there is a gap between the power price which a baseload technology would receive and the revenues for wind and PV. And this is also the case for a scenario with low CO2 prices, where of course the electricity price remains rather stable, but then again the market revenues for wind and PV are even lower than this wholesale price. So that's why, due to this intrinsic economic nature of the variable renewables, it's important to get this revenue stabilization mechanism still on the system. This is important to achieve the renewables targets at least cost. But it is also important because due to the capital intensity, any increases in the cost of capital directly affect the levelized cost of electricity. For example, a 1 percentage point increase in the capital cost for wind onshore would yield an 8% increase in the levelized cost of electricity for wind onshore. So again, highlighting the need for this element to achieve the targets at least cost. Now this means that the European framework now being developed in the context of the revision of the Renewables Directive should acknowledge the key role of such mechanisms to close the revenue gap. And over time then we will see, when moving to competitive tendering, where and when market conditions will be sufficient to fully finance renewables. It's important that this framework prohibits retroactive specifications which could devalue investments. It's also very important to keep priority access and priority dispatch also in the new framework, and also some stated elements could be translated into ordinary EU legislation. For example, also the meaningfulness and the need for technology-specific support should be reflected in this directive framework. And finally, of course, there are not only economic barriers, but also non-economic barriers. And here the framework should make national assessments of non-economic barriers obligatory, which would also be relevant in case EU-wide mechanisms are implemented, which should tackle with the capital cost issue, specifically in countries with higher risk and higher capital costs. And finally, since the 2030 renewables target is basically binding on a European level, but not on a member state level, of course the framework should consider how possible gaps between these national contributions and the EU-wide binding targets may be met and can be met. And finally, the last element, security or system adequacy safeguards. I think there are two really critical aspects. First of all, system adequacy should certainly or has to be assessed on a cross-border level. This is certainly beneficial because in a regional context, the sum of the peak loads of individual countries is higher than the peak load in the whole system or in the whole region due to smoothing effects and the correlations in the system. This means that basically fewer capacities are required than assessments on a purely national basis. So this simply reduces the costs of guaranteeing system adequacy, because you need fewer capacities, of course. And then secondly, and that links again to the flexibility challenge, Matthias already mentioned previously, in this new paradigm, system adequacy is not anymore about the pure amount, so how much capacities are installed, but it's increasingly about what kind of capacity. So it's about the capability of an installed capacity. Can it ramp up or ramp down quickly? Can it be started up quickly? Does it have a low must-run level, etc., etc. So this is really key to consider system adequacy, first of all, cross-border, and then consider it in terms of capability and flexibility, and not solely about installed capacity. This means then that any EU-level requirements for such domestic system adequacy safeguards, and there are several options from, let's say, strategic reserves which fully operate outside the energy markets, to adjusting payments within the energy market through adjusted scarcity prices, and finally, let's say, market-wide remuneration mechanisms. It's key that this EU-level framework indeed requires member states to perform cross-border adequacy assessments before implementing such domestic instruments, and secondly, that these mechanisms may not constrain the long-term decarbonization objectives and flexibility requirements. So member states should be, again, the national energy and climate plans in the context of the energy union would allow such an entry point. Such plans should account for the state of play of the system flexibility, and should also be used to ensure that any interventions regarding system adequacy are consistent with the long-term decarbonization requirements. So to wrap up, of course, there is a real-life challenge attached to that, namely how the specific elements can be designed as such that they are mutually supportive and do not contradict each other. I tried to highlight at some points already the spillovers between the two elements, but just to highlight and exemplify this specifically, there are certainly few things or some things which should not be done. For example, a capacity market should not be introduced that simply grants money to high carbon and inflexible assets, because this will both constrain decarbonization and flexibilization efforts. It's also, or the ETS should not be reformed on the assumption that it would be then able to fully refinance renewables, as the costs would be too high. Finally, of course, also energy-only markets should be enhanced, but without including the demand side or renewables, this will not be enough or delivering efficient outcomes. And importantly also, without implementing smart retirement policies, enhancing the energy-only market will not be able to do the job. In reverse, of course, speaking about renewables and markets, also renewables remuneration mechanisms should be redesigned with an eye on their effects on the energy-only market, so that we can move into this, let's say, flexibility challenge world without compromising both system adequacy but also system operations. And finally, this hints to the fact that we would think that market design should not be considered as a, let's say, silver bullet instrument kind of intervention, but rather think of several elements which all have to be combined in a sensible way. Of course, you can read more information on this and all specific provisions in the study, which is on our website, but there are also some other studies which deal a bit more with market design, so we encourage you to take a look at those. And for now, I'm looking forward to the Q&A session, and thanks for your attention.
So, thank you, Christian, for leading us to the nuts and bolts. We have had quite some questions coming in. Perhaps first there were two specific questions to slide 12. And Christian, perhaps you can say a word on that. And these were first on what exactly is being shown here, and a question by Mr. Haas. Do you indicate here that with a growing wholesale price, the revenue gap for wind and PV is also getting larger? That's a specific question. And what is really shown on this slide? There was a question on the legend.
Okay, thanks very much, and apologies for being a bit quick when going through this figure. I know it looks a bit overwhelming. Well, basically there are two important sources of information. The first one is the pink line is the power price. The solid pink line is the power price evolution here in this modeling from Öko Institute for Germany till 2045. In a scenario where CO2 prices increase to 45 euros per ton CO2. And then there are differently colored lines, and I want to draw your attention to the blue and yellow ones. This is the per megawatt hour remuneration, so the market revenues of sales from wind power and PV. And due to this cannibalization effect, as it's called, because wind and PV typically produce in times when the power prices are low, because then they typically set the power price, but they are not available in scarcity periods. When power prices spike, there is a gap between the average wholesale price, let's say a baseload technology would earn on a per megawatt hour basis, and a wind and PV plant. And the same is shown in the second scenario in the non-solid lines. For a low CO2 price of 5 euros per ton CO2. And indeed it looks like, and this points to the second question of Mr. Haas, that the revenue gap, at least in this scenario, is higher in the high CO2 price scenario, because simply the higher CO2 prices, the higher scarcity prices, so ours, when mainly then also inflexible and old fossil fuel power plants are required to meet the load. This steeply increases power prices, and in these hours wind and PV are not producing. So that's sort of this non-linear effect, which explains this increasing gap compared to the lower price scenario. Of course, this slide does not say yet, okay, how large is the revenue gap for renewables. Yeah? So if you take, for example, this yellow line, the per megawatt hour revenues a PV plant, large-scale PV plant in Germany would get over time compared to its total cost, the levelized cost of electricity. So this information is not in the slide, but of course you can imagine that the higher the market revenue, the lower the revenue gap between the market revenue of, say, this PV plant and its total costs.
Okay. So thanks. I think, Christian, that was a very helpful explanation. And now, picking up some of the other questions, there was a question on electric mobility and how this relates to the projected RES-E share of 50% by 2030. Now, I have to say, I would need to go back. So this projection is, of course, based on primes, so the Commission modeling, and I would need to go back to check with the primes modeling, but to recall this modeling dates from 2011, and so it might not be unlikely that due to the rapid decrease in battery costs for electric cars, there might be some recalibration necessary, but Christian is signaling to me that he has something more to say on that. Christian, please.
Well, I can add a bit. It's important that in this graph we didn't use the primes assumptions, but these are NSOE scenarios which are in line with the 2030 targets. And depending on the country where available, we also utilized national climate and energy strategies, which also typically cover forecasts for peak load and annual power consumption. So in the end, it then depends on the specific country and on the source. I would assume that in all the scenarios there is at least some slight trends towards electrification of the power and heating sectors, at least in our view. That's the way forward also to decarbonize heating and mobility by continuously electrifying these two sectors and utilizing renewable produced electricity. Of course, the exact extent to which this fuel shift is assumed in these scenarios, I also unfortunately cannot comment upon.
Thank you, Christian. Then we have a few questions on the issue of carbon floor price. And as most of you might be aware, the French government is currently leading a debate on a carbon floor price. I was reading yesterday that they will put in place a carbon floor price just for France soon. And they are also have been submitting documents to the, let's say, the EU policy process, where they're calling for a broader debate on an EU, perhaps EU carbon floor price. Now, there are two specific questions on this coming in. The first one, how would a French carbon floor price impact the German coal phase-out debate? I think that's a very interesting question, and to perhaps just to recall, the German coal phase-out debate is, at least at this juncture, very much shaped by the proposal Agora Energiewende made earlier this year on a planned phasing out of coal in Germany. Now, in the Agora proposal, there would be a regulated phasing out. This would not be based on just a market price, a minimum floor price for CO2 emissions being set, but it would be a regulated phasing out with some flexibility in different regions on how the phasing out would actually happen to pick up some of the more socio-economic challenges in particular regions. Now, this being said, of course, this proposal is different from what now France has proposed, a carbon floor price. And if you allow the colleague asking this question, I would just pass on your emails on this topic to the colleagues in Agora working on the coal phase-out proposal, because exactly how the interaction is seen, they are much better placed than Christian or I to reply to you on that. But I think it's an interesting issue that you're raising that will, of course, be also discussed in the German coal phase-out. Now, you're also asking whether a coordinated approach to minimum carbon floor pricing would be preferable. And indeed, if you're looking at our Pentagon paper, this is what we are proposing, that there should be a stable minimum CO2 price of 30 euros per ton of CO2 emissions, simply to have a stable expectation in the market that a fuel switch must happen. Now, the question you are asking, I think, is as much an economic one. So from an economic perspective, of course, it would be much preferable to have a coordinated approach to this. Whether this is realistic at an EU 28 level, I think, is a big question mark at the moment. And we are, as I was saying, proposing that the issue is being tackled also in the Brussels context, in context of the ongoing discussion on further reform to the EU ETS that is on the table of the Parliament and the Council. Another question coming in is very much on renewables, renewables policy, and this is on the appropriate type of support instruments. The question is, do you believe that a tender system that you assume to be in place, a tendering system, is preferable over feed-in tariffs. Now, to my mind, there's a slight difference between a feed-in tariff and a tendering system. A competitive tendering system, really is what you put in place to have a market-based setting of the needed support for investments to go forward. How the revenue gap that is then expected through or identified through the auction, how this revenue gap is being closed is then a question of how you design your support measure, whether it is a fixed premium on the market price, a floating market premium, whether we have a more classical feed-in tariff. So I think there are two a slight distinction here. It is my expectation that, and this is very much driven by EU state aid rules, that we are moving towards a system where competitive tendering is the default system in Europe for identifying the need and the adequate level of support wherever as the default. There are some de minimis thresholds in the system as it currently stands, and I also expect that there will need to be a debate on how to maintain some of the de minimis exemptions in the current system, not least to continue allowing citizen cooperatives, so community energy projects, to still participate actively in the energy transition, because there is of course a tendency, if you move to competitive tendering, that the larger market actors have some advantages over smaller market actors. So de minimis thresholds, in my mind, continue to be important, and this is something which we're also stating in this particular part of the paper. Now, we have a question, perhaps Christian, you can pick it up. The question is on storage policies and whether we think that a lack of storage policies among member states would hinder a cost-effective power system transformation.
Thanks for this question. I would like to take the liberty to maybe take it one level higher. Of course, it relates a lot to this first element, the refined market design for energy and balancing markets. And what in our view is key, that this market design should provide a level playing field so that all flexibility options can offer its flexibility potential on the market. This is important to also get the proper pricing on the markets. And here, certainly, some provisions in the balancing markets are very much centered towards centralized large-scale technologies. For example, long contracting periods, long product durations, which typically these new flexibility providers and new storage, like battery, for example, would be one of them, can typically not deliver, like demand response or new renewables. So it's, in our view, more important to get this level playing field implemented, which is then open to all technologies, and presumably there is no need to, let's say, implement regulations or market design provisions which are targeted to just one specific technology option.
Thank you. There was a problem with my mic. So thank you, Christian. Another question I think interesting is on the balance between increasing interconnectivity and what's the effect on baseload generation and on the mix in Europe given the current market conditions. So really, in a way, challenging what you were saying, that this would be a good measure to facilitate, to address the flexibility challenge, and what do you make out of enhanced interconnectivity given current market conditions? Does it work against what we want to achieve, or does it help?
Yeah, thanks. It's a very good question. It also has, I think, several dimensions to it. First of all, increasing interconnection is indeed important to tackle the flexibility challenge from a ramping point of view. So, for example, if you take the hourly ramps of wind power in a, let's say, domestic power system, and then compare the overall European wind ramp that emerges at the same time, if you integrate all the countries on an integrated energy market, you see that these hourly ramps are reduced by half. So through integration, you basically get rid of 50% or half of your flexibility challenge, which is of course a very sensible manner. At the same time, and specifically, and that's where I think your point now becomes very relevant, we are not operating, let's say, in a greenfield approach. We have this existing power system with typically legacy baseload investments. And then, of course, giving the economics in the current system, low CO2 prices, also low fossil fuel prices, of course, meaning that coal-fired power plants, and specifically lignite-fired power plants, which would be the core baseload technology in the coal sector, benefits from increasing interconnections. Now the question is, how quickly will interconnections be increased? There are, of course, ambitious plans on a European level to increase that. For example, if we look at Germany, since years already, Germany is increasing its annual electricity exports, mainly because gas power plants in the neighboring countries are being shut down or mothballed due to the economic conditions, and then, let's say, cheap baseload power from Germany can be exported. Currently, we're in a situation where, let's say, the interconnectors are more or less fully utilized. So if we were to implement quickly now additional interconnectors, of course, these exports would increase. But at the same time, the picture will change post-2020 when Germany has exited from nuclear power. This will reduce the export potential, and also, of course, we expect that the discussions on the phase-out of coal gain momentum in Germany. But this links to this element 3 of the power market design, of course, and that's again the holistic point of view we would like to feed into discussion. Smart retirement of these old and inflexible high carbon capacities will be important, not only for the market design to be fully effective, but also for the climate targets.
Yep. Thank you, Christian. I realize it's already 3 minutes past over the time, so we have to wrap up. We have a number of open questions. Just to run through them, we have a very interesting question, I think, on the predictability of scarcity prices in the system, which we will take up by email later on. We have a question on the debate that's currently ongoing on capacity mechanisms, where DG Competition published last week, I believe it was, a sector inquiry, an interim report on the sector inquiry into capacity mechanisms in Europe, which they are doing. And there's also one question I still feel inclined to reply to, at least very briefly, and this is on the balance between priority dispatch and tackling market failures, and the basic observation being that if you're serious about expecting 50% less e-share in 2030, then of course priority dispatch as such becomes less meaningful to the system. And would it not be preferable, rather than to insist on priority dispatch being maintained, as we mentioned in under this element 4 of the Pentagon, to tackle market failures and make it less necessary. And I have to say I agree with the question in the sense that in a much improved market environment, of course, priority dispatch would be much less of an issue to give investors into renewables certainty or larger certainty on the revenues they can obtain. But of course, at this juncture in the debate, we have little knowledge on where we will stand with the market reforms, let's say in 5 to 10 years' time, and how the market environment will look like at that point. There are major question marks on the ETS, as we were saying, on the issue of smart retirement, which is currently not at all debated in Brussels, at least to a sufficient extent. And so these are major aspects of the debate, which in our view, of course, have a bearing on whether a priority dispatch as such becomes less important. So for the time being, we believe that priority dispatch really maintains an important role in the system. In addition, just looking at priority dispatch as a tool, of course, if you're removing the priority dispatch obligation in the current legislation, then you have need to have a much closer look on curtailment provisions in the member states and how this is practically being applied, which is something that is not as such addressed at a very high level of detail in the current framework, and there might be more hesitation by member states to go into details of curtailment rules as they're being applied at national level than to have a principle of priority dispatch. So that's my observation, but I think it's an important debate to be had, and how the different parts link to each other, and this is in a way exactly the type of debate that we hope to generate with this Pentagon paper. As I was saying in the introduction, this is really an effort to holistically address the market design debate, not only focusing on two elements which are quite well explored, but perhaps not sufficiently realistic as to what they can deliver. And just the last question I was trying to reply to really highlights how the different facets of the debate are necessary to be looked at holistically. Now, as I was saying, we are already almost 10 minutes over time. I think this was an interesting session. Thank you to Christian. Thank you to Nicola for your quiet but reliable support and help. And it was a pleasure to present to you, and many thanks for your questions. As I was saying at the end of the last webinar, if you want to be kept up to date with what Agora is doing, events, new publications, please go to our website and register for our newsletter. This is not a spamming device, clearly not, but we are using it economically, so you will receive mailings here and there to keep you up to date, but we will not be flooding your inbox if you register. So thanks again for your time, and thanks Christian, thanks Nicola. It was a pleasure. Yeah, see and speak you next time.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.